My son said I was too old to manage the portfolio, and he tried to take power of attorney behind my back. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in my own study, reading a document his lawyer accidentally copied me on. I sold every equity position I owned within 24 hours and moved the entire sum into sovereign gold bonds. The next morning, the stock market dropped 30% in a single trading session. 40 years I built that portfolio. 40 years of early mornings reading financial reports before sunrise, of skipping vacations to reinvest dividends, of teaching myself the market one hard lesson at a time because nobody ever handed me a shortcut. My son grew up watching me build it. He grew up benefiting from it. And the moment he decided I had slowed down too much to be trusted with my own money, he went looking for a lawyer instead of a conversation. He hired a doctor willing to write whatever he needed written. He filed papers in a courthouse 2 counties over, hoping I would never notice until it was already too late to fight back. He moved fast because he believed a 71-year-old man would move slow. He was wrong about that. I built my career reading warning signs before other people saw them coming. I read one that Tuesday afternoon in my own son's handwriting, and I acted before he ever expected me capable of acting. What happened over the next few weeks tested every relationship I had left. It cost me sleep, it cost me trust, and it nearly cost me the one son I had left in this world. But it also proved something I had spent 4 decades trying to teach him, and he never once sat still long enough to learn it. Stay with me because this story ends somewhere neither of us saw coming. Before we start, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, drop a comment when you reach the part that gets you, and subscribe so you catch the next one. My name is Harold Bennett, and I am 71 years old. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a small rented house 2 blocks from the rail yard, where the trains rattled the windows every night around midnight, and my father worked double shifts as a machinist just to keep the lights on. We did not have much. My mother sewed our clothes by hand and stretched a single chicken across 3 dinners a week. I wore my older brother's hand-me-down shoes until they fell apart at the seams, and I remember walking to school some winters with cardboard lining the holes in the soles because new shoes were not in the budget that year. My father lost his job when I was 11 years old during a round of layoffs at the machine shop that gutted half our neighborhood in a single month. I watched him sit at our kitchen table night after night, sorting through bills he could not pay, his jaw tight, his pride cracking a little more each week. That image never left me. A grown man, broken not by laziness or bad choices, but by circumstances completely outside his control, because he never had savings to fall back on and never understood how money actually worked beyond the paycheck he earned each Friday. My mother took in laundry from 3 families in our neighborhood to help cover the gap that year, boiling water on our stove late into the night, and hanging sheets on lines strung across our small backyard, no matter the weather. I remember helping her fold towels at 9 years old, listening to her hum old hymns under her breath to keep herself steady through the exhaustion. She never complained where my brother and I could hear her. She saved her worry for after we went to bed, when she thought the thin walls of our house hid her quiet crying from us. They never did. I decided right then, young as I was, that I would understand money better than my father ever had the chance to. I started reading the newspaper business section at age 12, borrowing copies from the library since we could not afford our own subscription. I did not understand half of what I read at first, but I kept at it, word by word, term by term, until the language of stocks and bonds and interest rates stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like a puzzle I could actually solve. I remember a librarian named Mrs. Pearson, who noticed me coming back week after week to the same shelf of financial almanacs, and she started setting aside older business magazines for me before they went into the discard bin. She never said much about it, just slid them across the counter with a small nod, like she understood exactly what a poor kid clinging to numbers on a page was actually reaching for. I have thought about her more over the years than she probably ever realized, because that quiet kindness from a stranger taught me something about generosity I carried into my own life decades later. School came easy enough for me, though we never had money for college tuition. I enlisted in the Army at 18, partly for the structure, partly because the GI Bill promised an education I could not otherwise afford. I served 4 years as a supply logistics clerk stationed mostly at Fort Sill, keeping meticulous records of equipment and inventory, work that sharpened the same careful, detail-oriented mind I would later apply to reading balance sheets and earnings reports. My commanding officer used to joke that I could account for a missing paperclip faster than anyone else on base, and looking back, that discipline became the foundation for everything I built afterward. I came home to Tulsa and used my benefits to study finance at a state university, working nights at a gas station to cover what the GI Bill did not. I met my wife, Carol, during my second year of school. She worked the counter at a diner near campus, and she had a sharp wit that could cut through my quiet, careful nature in about 2 sentences flat. We married young, poor, and completely in love, the kind of poor where you count exact change for a movie ticket and call it a perfect date night anyway. Our son, Craig, was born 3 years later, right around the time I landed my first real job at a regional investment firm downtown. I worked my way up slowly over the following decade, learning the market inside and out, making mistakes early that taught me more than any textbook ever could. I lost almost everything Carol and I had saved during one bad stretch in my early 30s, a string of overconfident trades that wiped out 2 years of careful saving in about 6 terrible weeks. I remember sitting across from Carol at our kitchen table, the same way my father once sat at his, sorting through what remained of our savings. She did not yell at me that night. She just took my hand and said, "You'll learn from this, Harold. I know you will. Just don't let pride make the same mistake twice." I never did. That failure taught me more discipline than any success ever could have. I spent the following year studying exactly where my judgment had failed. Tracking every bad trade back to the moment I let excitement override research. I built a set of rules for myself after that, simple ones, written on an index card I kept taped inside my desk drawer for the next 30 years. Never invest in anything I cannot explain in 2 plain sentences. Never chase a trade because I am afraid of missing out. Always ask what I would tell a stranger to do with their life savings before I do it with my own. I rebuilt slowly after that, methodically, refusing to chase quick wins again. By the time I turned 40, I had left the investment firm and started managing my own portfolio full-time, applying every lesson those early losses had burned into me. Patience over excitement, research over instinct. Never risk what you cannot afford to lose twice. Craig grew up watching all of it, the poor years and the recovery both, though he was too young to remember the worst of the early struggles by the time he understood what money actually meant. He grew up in a comfortable house, with a nice car waiting for him at 16 and a fully funded college education, Carol, and I never had to think twice about affording. I built that comfort for him with my own 2 hands, one careful, patient decision at a time, exactly the way I promised myself I would back when I was a boy walking to school with cardboard in my shoes. I made a point of teaching Craig the value of money even as we grew more comfortable, taking him to open his first savings account at age 8, showing him compound interest charts at the kitchen table the way another father might show a son how to throw a baseball. I wanted him to understand not just that we had money, but why we had it, and what discipline it took to keep it growing responsibly across a lifetime. Looking back now, I wonder if I taught him the mechanics of wealth without ever fully teaching him the patience and humility that has to sit underneath it. I never imagined that same son would one day look at everything I built and decide I had become too old to be trusted with it. Craig grew into a sharp, ambitious young man, and I was proud of him in ways I probably never said out loud often enough. He studied finance himself, following a path close enough to mine that people used to joke he was following in my footsteps. He landed a job at a wealth management firm in Dallas right out of college, and within a decade, he climbed to senior vice president, managing portfolios for clients far wealthier than I ever became myself. Craig's world moved fast, built around quarterly performance targets and constant pressure from clients who wanted immediate results rather than the slow, patient compounding I had built my own career around. He married Melissa, a corporate attorney with an equally demanding career, and the two of them built a polished, impressive life in a gated Dallas suburb, complete with private schools for their two children and a social calendar full of charity galas and client dinners. I never judged the life they built. It simply looked nothing like the one Carol and I had chosen, and I think that difference quietly widened a gap between Craig's world and mine long before any conservatorship filing ever entered the picture. Carol and I stayed in Tulsa the whole time, in the same modest neighborhood where I had built my career, even after my portfolio grew large enough that we could have moved anywhere we wanted. I never saw the point in flashy houses or expensive cars. I drove the same reliable sedan for 11 years. I found more satisfaction watching my investments compound quietly over decades than I ever found in spending money to impress people I did not particularly need to impress. By the time I turned 65, my portfolio had grown into something substantial, built almost entirely from patient, long-term positions in solid companies, real estate holdings across 3 states, and a diversified bond ladder I maintained with the same discipline I had learned from my worst mistakes 40 years earlier. I never stopped managing it myself. I read financial reports every single morning before sunrise, the exact same habit I started as a 12-year-old boy borrowing newspapers from the library. Carol passed away when I was 68, after a long fight with cancer that took 18 months to finally win. Losing her broke something in me that never fully healed, and honestly, I think that loss is where Craig's concerns about me first started taking root, even if neither of us named it clearly at the time. I grieved slowly and quietly, the same way I had always processed hard things, and maybe from the outside, that quiet grief looked like decline to a son who did not know how else to interpret it. I stopped going to my regular Tuesday breakfast with old Army friends for almost 6 months after the funeral. I let mail pile up on the counter longer than I should have some weeks. None of it meant my mind had slowed down. It meant a man who had loved the same woman for 43 years needed time to remember how to function inside a house that suddenly felt too quiet. I understand now, looking back, how easily a grieving widower's routine changes could be mistaken for something more serious by someone watching from 300 miles away in Dallas, catching only brief glimpses during holiday visits and phone calls. Craig started calling more often after Carol passed, checking in on me in ways that felt caring at first. He would ask about my daily routine, my sleep, whether I was eating properly. I appreciated it genuinely for the first year or so. Grief makes a person vulnerable, and it felt good knowing my son still worried about me the way a good son should. But somewhere in the second year, the questions shifted. He started asking specifically about my finances during nearly every call. Which positions had I sold recently? Whether I had reviewed my portfolio with anyone else lately? Whether I still remembered all my account passwords or needed help organizing them somewhere safer? Small questions, easy to answer, but frequent enough that I started noticing a pattern I did not like. The real turning point came during Thanksgiving dinner at his house in Dallas, about 2 years after Carol passed. Craig's wife, Melissa, mentioned almost casually over dessert that Craig had been reading about elder financial protection strategies, the kind of language usually reserved for families dealing with genuine cognitive decline. I asked him directly what that meant, and he brushed it off, saying it was just general research for his job, nothing specific to me. Melissa's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment when he said it, a small, quick glance that told me she did not fully believe his answer either, though she said nothing more about it at the table. I let it go that night, mostly because I did not want to ruin a holiday with unnecessary suspicion toward my own son. But the comment sat with me for weeks afterward, an itch I could not quite scratch. I found myself replaying small moments from the visit on the drive home, the way Craig had watched me sign the restaurant bill the night before, studying my handwriting a beat longer than a simple dinner receipt required. 3 months later, I hosted Craig and Melissa for a weekend visit in Tulsa. I noticed him spending an unusual amount of time in my home office while I napped one afternoon, longer than any reasonable errand should have required. When I woke and walked past the open door, I saw him photographing pages from an old file folder with his phone, quickly setting it down when he heard my footsteps in the hallway. When I asked him about it later, he said he was just looking for a phone charger. I did not press further, though something in my gut, the same instinct that had saved me from bad trades 100 times over the years, told me not to fully believe him. That instinct turned out to be correct, and I would not fully understand how correct until a single misdirected email landed in my inbox 2 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that started out like any other day of my life and ended up changing everything. The email came from Craig's own lawyer, a man named Gregory Pratt, intended for Craig's personal address but sent by mistake to an old shared family account Craig, and I had set up years earlier for splitting utility bills on a rental property we co-owned. Pratt's assistant had simply grabbed the wrong contact from an autofill list, a small clerical mistake that unraveled everything Craig had spent months carefully building behind my back. The email contained a draft petition for a limited conservatorship over my financial affairs, along with a supporting letter from a physician named Dr. Alan Marsh, someone I had never met in my entire life, claiming to have evaluated me and found early signs of cognitive decline sufficient to justify transferring financial decision-making authority to my son. The letter cited specific dates and supposed office visits, none of which had ever taken place, along with a checklist of memory and reasoning tests I had never once sat for in my life. I read that email 3 times before the words fully settled into something real. My hands were steady, though my heart pounded hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. Craig had never once brought me to any doctor named Alan Marsh. I had never sat for any cognitive evaluation. The entire letter was fabricated, built on a foundation of nothing, designed to convince a judge that a man who still read financial reports at 5 every morning had somehow lost the capacity to manage his own money. I called Craig immediately, and he did not answer. I called again an hour later, and he still did not answer. By evening, I understood clearly that he had no intention of explaining himself until he was forced to. I sat alone in my study that whole evening, the same room Craig had lingered in months earlier photographing my old files, and I let myself feel the full weight of what he had tried to do. Not the financial threat of it, though that mattered too, but the deeper betrayal of a son who decided, quietly and without warning, that his own father no longer deserved a say in his own life. I thought about Carol, about what she would have said sitting across from me at that kitchen table, and I knew exactly what her answer would have been. Get up, Harold. Handle this the way you handle everything else, carefully and completely. I did not call him a third time. Instead, I called my own attorney, a longtime friend named Susan Whitcomb who had handled my estate planning for over a decade and knew exactly how careful and sharp I remained at every single meeting we had ever held together. I told her everything, and her voice went cold and serious the moment I finished explaining. Harold, she said, we need to move fast and we need to move smart. If they're building a case for incapacity, the strongest thing you can do right now is demonstrate exactly the opposite. Show a judge in real time that you're capable of sharp, decisive, well-reasoned financial judgment. That conversation planted the seed for what I did next. I had been quietly watching certain economic indicators for months already, entirely separate from anything happening with Craig. Inflation data looked unstable. Several major banks had begun showing warning signs in their quarterly earnings that reminded me uncomfortably of patterns I had studied from past downturns. My gut, sharpened by 40 years of reading markets before other people noticed the same signals, told me equities were sitting on far shakier ground than most financial news outlets were willing to admit publicly. I pulled up regional bank balance sheets that night, cross-referencing loan default rates against figures from previous downturns I had lived through personally, including the crisis that had wiped out 2 years of savings back when Craig was still a toddler. The patterns lined up closely enough that my old instincts started ringing the same alarm bells they had rung decades earlier, back when I was still young enough that nobody questioned whether I could trust my own judgment. I had already been planning to shift a significant portion of my portfolio toward safer, more stable holdings regardless of anything happening with Craig. His betrayal simply forced my hand to act immediately instead of gradually over the following months, the way I originally intended. I spent that entire Tuesday night at my desk, the same desk where Craig had been caught lingering months earlier, reviewing my full equity holdings position by position. By morning, I had made my decision. I liquidated every single equity position in my portfolio, moving the entire sum into sovereign gold bonds, a stable, government-backed holding that historically performs well during periods of market instability. Exactly the kind of instability my research suggested was building beneath the surface of an overheated market. I documented every single decision in writing that same day, time-stamped, with detailed notes explaining my exact reasoning for each move, specifically anticipating that Susan would need clear evidence of sound, sophisticated financial judgment if this situation ever reached a courtroom. The very next morning, the stock market opened low and kept falling. By the closing bell, major indexes had dropped nearly 30% in a single catastrophic trading session, the worst single-day decline in over a decade, triggered by a sudden banking crisis that caught most of Wall Street completely off guard. My phone rang within the hour. It was Craig, and for the first time in months, his voice on the other end sounded less like a son managing his father and a lot more like a man who suddenly needed him. If you have ever had a moment where your own judgment got quietly proven right in the worst possible way, drop a comment below, because this story still has a courtroom left to walk through, and it does not go the way either Craig or I expected. Craig showed up at my house in Tulsa 2 days after the market crash, arriving without calling ahead for the first time since I could remember. He looked exhausted, his usual polished composure completely gone, replaced by something closer to panic. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Carol once told me to learn from my mistakes instead of repeating them, and he finally admitted everything. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager. "After Mom died, you seemed so lost for a while. I convinced myself you weren't thinking clearly anymore, that someone needed to step in before you made a mistake that wiped out everything you built. I should have just talked to you, Dad. I know that now." I sat quietly for a long moment before responding, letting the weight of his confession settle in the room between us. Grief had hollowed me out for a while after Carol passed, that much was true. But grief and incapacity are not the same thing, and a real conversation, an honest one, would have shown him exactly how sharp I remained the entire time. Instead, he chose secrecy, a fabricated medical letter, and a courtroom filing designed to strip away my independence without ever giving me the chance to defend myself. "You didn't come to me because you were worried, Craig," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger still sitting heavy in my chest. "You came to a lawyer because it was faster than facing me directly. That's not protection. That's control, and somewhere along the way you convinced yourself those two things were the same." He did not argue back. He just sat there, staring at his hands folded on the table, and for the first time in years, I saw him look genuinely young again, like the same boy who once cried at this table over a broken bike instead of a broken trust. I did not shout at him that day, though a part of me wanted to. I simply told him the truth, calmly and clearly, the same way I had delivered hard truths in boardrooms for 40 years. You watched that 30% crash wipe out client portfolios you personally manage in Dallas, I said. My entire net worth sat protected in gold bonds while you were busy trying to convince a judge I couldn't be trusted to see it coming. Craig had no response to that, none at all. The conservatorship petition never made it to a courtroom because Susan Whitcomb contacted Gregory Pratt directly the following week, presenting him with my detailed financial documentation, my timestamped decision notes, and a formal complaint regarding Dr. Alan Marsh, who, as it turned out, held a suspended medical license in 2 states for writing fraudulent evaluations for exactly this kind of family dispute. Pratt withdrew the petition immediately once he understood the fraudulent evaluation could expose his own firm to serious liability, and Dr. Marsh eventually lost his license entirely after a state medical board investigation confirmed a pattern of similar fabricated letters across several other cases. Susan told me later that Pratt's voice changed the moment she mentioned Marsh's suspended license in the other state, a detail Craig apparently never bothered to verify himself before hearing the man. That single oversight, born out of urgency and poor judgment rather than any real due diligence, unraveled the entire scheme faster than either of us expected going into that phone call. Susan said it reminded her of exactly the kind of shortcut mistake young, ambitious professionals make when they let panic outrun patience, the very mistake I had spent my whole life training myself never to repeat. Craig avoided formal legal consequences himself, mostly because Susan and I made a deliberate choice not to pursue further action against him directly. I did not want my son facing fraud charges over a decision born, however badly executed, out of grief and misguided fear rather than pure greed. But I made it clear to him, sitting at that same kitchen table, that trust between us had been badly broken, and rebuilding it would take real time, real honesty, and real patience on both our parts. I forgive you, Craig, I told him, but forgiveness and trust are 2 different things. You're going to have to earn the second one back slowly, the same way I built everything you tried to take control of. He nodded, and for the first time in over a year, I saw something honest in his face instead of calculation. The months following that conversation were not easy, but they were honest, which mattered more to me than easy ever could. Craig started calling regularly again, though the calls felt different now, less like surveillance and more like genuine connection. He asked about my day instead of my passwords. He asked about my memories of Carol instead of my recent portfolio moves. I eventually walked him through my full financial reasoning behind the gold bond decision, not to prove a point, though I will admit some satisfaction in doing so, but because I wanted him to understand the discipline behind it. I explained the economic indicators I had been tracking for months, the patterns from past downturns I recognized building again, the decades of study that led me to trust my own judgment even when it meant moving against conventional market wisdom. This is exactly the kind of thinking I should have been asking you to teach me, he admitted one evening, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table, instead of assuming you'd lost the ability to think at all. We rebuilt our relationship slowly over the following year, one honest conversation at a time. I eventually updated my estate planning with Susan's help, not to punish Craig, but to build in real safeguards and clear communication requirements that protect both of us from ever repeating this kind of secrecy again. I named Craig as an eventual co-trustee alongside Susan, giving him a genuine role in my financial legacy, but only once he had demonstrated, through a full year of honest behavior, that he understood the difference between protecting his father and controlling him. I still manage my own portfolio every single morning, the same disciplined routine I started as a 12-year-old boy reading borrowed newspapers in a library in Tulsa. I moved a portion of my gold bond holdings back into carefully selected equities once the market stabilized months later, applying the same patient, research-driven approach that built my wealth in the first place. My net worth today sits stronger than it did before the crash, not because I got lucky, but because I trusted 40 years of hard-earned instinct over a courtroom filing designed to silence it. Melissa and I grew closer during that year as well, in a way I did not fully expect. She told me once, over coffee during a visit to Tulsa, that she had voiced quiet concerns to Craig early on about the path he was taking, and that watching him nearly destroy his relationship with me had changed how she approached her own aging parents entirely. She started scheduling honest, direct conversations with them about their finances and their wishes, rather than letting assumptions and fear build silently in the background the way Craig's had. I think that ripple effect, more than anything else, is the part of this whole ordeal I am proudest of. Craig and I talk every week now, real conversations, the kind we should have been having all along. He recently asked me to formally mentor him on long-term portfolio strategy, admitting that his high-pressure Dallas firm had trained him to chase short-term performance in ways that left him personally less prepared than he ever wanted to admit. I agreed without hesitation, grateful for the chance to teach my son the lessons my own father never had the opportunity to teach me. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If it made you think about your own family, your own parents, or the quiet strength that comes from earning your judgment through decades of hard lessons, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what stood out to you most, or share a story of your own if this one struck close to home. If you are new here, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about trust, family, and the quiet battles fought at kitchen tables that most of the world never sees. I will see you in the next one.